Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 133. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in Swamp Thing in the past couple issues. Swamp Thing had made a promise to Abby that he would not leave her again for something that happens in the green. Then the Sunderland Corporation made a monster called Project Proteus, who was made of toxic waste, and it hurt the earth so bad that Swamp Thing had to break his promise to Abby. But before he left, he decided it would be a good idea to make a double of himself so that she wouldn't know that he left. And it turned out that while he was gone fighting that monster, the double actually fell in love with Swamp Thing's family life. And when Swamp Thing finally returned 2 weeks later, he looked a lot different because he had a new body because his old body was corrupted by toxic waste. So he looks different. And because of that, Abby did not recognize him as her husband. And also she has the double there who looks exactly like her husband should and is acting like her husband should. And Tefe did not recognize him as her father. And the double Swamp Thing was also very angry because now that the real Swamp Thing was back, he was going to lose everything that he'd grown to love over the last couple weeks. So in the last issue, we had the Swamp Things battle it out. And this was a pretty epic fight. But at the end, of course, our Swamp Thing, the original one, was the victorious one. But during this fight, there was a big release of energy in the green because the fight was so strenuous on both of them. And this made the green go wacky all over the world. We saw in Gotham and New York, plants were killing people and growing all crazy and stuff. So once the battle was over, most of that subsided, but one thing did not, and that was the leader of the flower people that Tefe had made previously. During the Swamp Thing's fight, the leader of the Daisy people grew to be the size of a skyscraper. And we were left at the end of the last issue with this giant warrior flower king set to destroy the area in the swamp that Swamp Thing's house is in. And at the same time that was going on, a policeman named Officer Rawls and a racist man named Ben Barron showed up at the Swamp Thing house to take away Tefe from her parents. So that's where we left off with a giant flower monster attacking Child Protective Services at their door, and Abby being extremely hurt and angry that Swamp Thing would trick her by making a double. So first things first, with issue 133, we got the cover. We see there is a very large flower that looks like it's been drawn by a child. It's kind of got the feel of if it's been drawn with sidewalk chalk or something like that. But the flower has a very evil face with very sharp teeth, and it is looking down on a baby Tefe who is playing with some other little flower people that she has strung in a row in front of her. And this issue is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMolder. And we start off on the first page with the giant flower king, and he is towering over the house that Swamp Thing and his wife and child live in, and he's saying, la 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 la. So we're picking up exactly where we left off in the last issue. So we cut to the front porch where we see Officer Rawls, Ben Barron, the racist Republican candidate for governor, and Abby, and they're all staring up at this giant flower monster that's approaching them. And Officer Rawls says, "What the hell is that?" And then I guess because it's a giant flower monster, he also adds, "Is it dangerous?" And as if to answer that question, the giant flower monster reaches out and grabs Ben Barron saying, la la la. And Barron yells out, "Ah, put me down." And as the Flower King brings Ben Barron to his face, he says, la la la. And then he proceeds to shove Ben Barron in his mouth, and Ben Barron yells out, "No!" Then we cut to Abby and Rawls, who are just looking at this horrific scene, and we just hear crunch, la la, crunch. And Abby is covering her face in disgust, and Rawls is saying, "Sweet Jesus." So they take off running, and Abby, while she's running, yells, "Yeah, it is dangerous." And then the Flower King smashes the back end of their house by stepping on it, saying, la la la. Then as we turn the page, we get a little backstory on this Flower King. Now, the only thing we've known previous to this is that there's a flower civilization that Tefe has accidentally created when she was learning how to grow flowers, and also because she's part demon and human, she can also create life in the flesh sense. So her first creation were these little daisy people that were sentient but weren't quite sophisticated. But as Dr. Malcolm says in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And apparently they were able to grow and evolve, and they had become a civilization kind of like warring tribes for a while. So that is where we pick up in this flashback history of this Flower King. So we get a panel of the Flower King when he was small and normal size, looking angrily with his weapon as all these other happy flowers dance in a circle. And the narration says, Thunder Petal had always been different from his brothers. He dared to dream of greatness and claim it for his own. And under that narration, we're seeing him use this axe that he has brought to this circle of dancing flowers to kill one of them, who I guess was their previous king. And then he is standing over the bloody body of this flower, raising his axe like he's Conan the Barbarian. Then we see him being pulled in a makeshift carriage that they made out of a tuna can and a couple thread bobbins, and he is whipping the other flowers that are pulling him, so they must be slaves. And the narration continues. Thunder Petal believed there would be no greater destiny than that of leader, but that was before the hand of God came down and touched him, infusing him with power undreamt of by simple daisies. Then we're seeing him cry out in pain at the moment of the green freaking out in the last issue. And that catches us up to present day, where King Thunder Petal is now gigantic and he is lording over Swamp Thing's area in the swamp. And the narration continues. Now Thunder Petal realized how small his ambition has been. There is so much to this strange new world, and all of it is for the picking. And I just realized I have not described Thunder Petal, so let me do that right now. He has a very simple body that is just a torso with 4 limbs. They are green and covered with some kind of leaves. And the leaves are mostly around his midsection, where I guess his groin would be, and around his collar and chest. And his head and face are made up of a red flower with a yellow center, so the red petals kind of surround his yellow face. And you could probably tell by the way he was described earlier, but he is very buff, of course, like his arms and stuff look very much more yoked than the other flowers did. And his face looks very angry and mean. And he has always looked like that. He has very thick brows, he has lots of wrinkles on his forehead, and he just looks like he's got a lot of anger in his little flower heart. So now that we have the backstory on Thunder Petal, we cut back to Rawls and Abby, who are running to his boat. And as Rawls jumps on it, he says, I told that damn fool it was his funeral, but he wouldn't listen to me. No, he had to come out here and mess with folk he had no business messing with. First, it's Cypress acting like the trees of the Wizard of Oz, social workers eaten by alligators, and now giant carnivorous daisies? Give me a crack posse any day of the week. And just as he's about to throttle out of there and leave Abby on the edge of the water, Abby calls out to him saying, Officer Rawls, please take me with you. And Rawls is a little confused and he says, I thought you lived here. And as tears stream down Abby's face, she says, I used to think so too. Then we cut to Swamp Thing and Lady Jane and Tefe. And apparently they haven't heard anything of the ruckus that Thunder Petal has been making in the swamp just a little bit away from them. So Swamp Thing is talking to Lady Jane and he says, I have to make Abby understand why I did what I did. And Lady Jane replies, I seriously doubt it will be that easy, Prime Founder. And Swamp Thing says, she will believe me. I am her husband, aren't I? Then finally they hear a loud crash and Swamp Thing says, what? And then they move out from where they are in the swamps towards Swamp Thing's house, and they come into a clearing, and finally they see the destruction that the gigantic Thunder Petal has caused to his house. And Swamp Thing exclaims, by the founders. So as they get closer to the house to inspect it, they see in the distance the shadow outline of the giant King Thunder Petal walking away from them in the bayou. And Lady Jane turns to Swamp Thing and says, I'm afraid the battle with your doppelganger has had unforeseen side effects. And then Tefe sees the big flower monster and says, Daddy, look, big flower. Then we cut to the Sunderland Corporation headquarters in Washington, D.C., and we cut inside the building to Connie Sunderland and Dr. Polygon walking together. And Dr. Polygon is saying to her, I fed all the data taken from traditional sources into the PC and had it compute when the necessary astrological, astronomical, and metaphysical supernatural planes would be in proper alignment. According to the computer, there will be a 15-second window of opportunity. We will have to act fast. Then we see them enter an area called the Metaphysics Laboratory, and Connie asks Dr. Polygon, Are we prepared? And Polygon answers, As we'll ever be. Then as they enter the restricted area in the metaphysics laboratory, we see Dr. Polygon is putting on some kind of robe, but he's in silhouette and he has handed one to Connie and she's saying, "Is this really necessary?" And Dr. Polygon says, "It's uncertain what elements of the rituals actually affect the outcome of the spell. I consider it prudent to cover all the bases. Who knows? Success may very well hinge on the correct ratio of dove's blood to unbaptized baby's fat." And in the next panel, we see what they were putting on, and you could also see why Connie was hesitant to put it on, because they're both wearing dark, deep red ceremonial robes. And as they enter Dr. Polygon's laboratory, he turns the light switch on and says, "Let's get this show on the road, why don't we?" And as we turn the page, we get a full-page splash of what his laboratory looks like lit up. We can see the cryopod of General Sunderland placed in the center of a giant pentagram that's painted on the floor. And above it, we see a man hanging down upside down naked on a cross. And his blood is dripping from his arms and head. And he's saying, "Help me." So as they enter, Dr. Polygon goes to his computer and he has a printer at his desk. And he goes to it because there's a couple pages that are printed out, and they're the kind that you can kind of tear off because they're perforated. So he rips them off and he hands them to Connie saying, "Here you go, Miss Sunderland. I had the computer break down the spell phonetically." And she does not take the paper immediately and actually says, "You expect me to actually participate?" And with an evil smile, Dr. Polygon retorts, "He is your father, isn't he?" And then he hands Connie Sunderland a golden goblet, and he says to her, "As the saying goes, Miss Sunderland, in for a penny, in for a pound." And with that, Dr. Proteus begins the spell. He holds his hands up, and we can see he's holding a giant butcher knife as well. And he begins the spell saying, "Prepotens Lucifer, Havante Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, Elmai, Antke Astaroth." And then Connie continues with the rest of it saying, "Domine, Macisterque, Lucifer Tedurn et Principum Agnosco, et Policicor tibi severe, et obedere quandir potoro vivere." And then Dr. Polygon leans forward and he begins to slit the throat of the man who's hanging on the cross. And the man begs him, saying, "Please, now, polissima amorium molirium, florem quorinum desus monarchum." And as the blood begins to spill, he continues saying, "Factum in infernus interconcilia demonium." Then we see Connie lean forward and collect the blood from the man's slit throat. And Dr. Polygon continues the incantation, "Macister diabolis et demonis principalis domini." And then both of them grab the goblet of blood and they say, "Amen." And then Dr. Polygon pours the goblet of blood onto the top of the cryogenic pod, and instantly it begins to spark, and you can see kind of magic coming off of it, and Dr. Polygon yells out, "Holy!" But he is cut off by the top of the pod, which blows off, and then out of it, we see a very icy General Sunderland sit up, and Connie looks at him and says, "Daddy?" And Sunderland gets an evil smile on his face, and he says, "Connie." And we can see in this panel that behind him, there is a little bit of mist, and that mist is in the shape of Anton Arcane. So this is not actually Dr. Sunderland rising. It is just his body possessed by Anton Arcane. Then we cut to a town we haven't been to, I don't think, called Paratonnerre, Louisiana. And we see a Cajun man walking on the streets, and he sees one of his friends on a porch carving an alligator out of wood, and he says hello. And just as his friend replies, the man who was walking gets taken up and pulled off the ground by Thunder Petal. And Thunder Petal holds the man up to his face, and he smiles evilly, and he says, "La, la, la, la." And then he throws the man into his mouth and begins chomping down. And as he does this, we see from the ground Swamp Thing is approaching him and watching this monster eat a person. And Swamp Thing says, "I am responsible for that creature." And Lady Jane says behind him, "During your battle with your double, an incredible amount of elemental energy was unleashed. Since the Daisy was at ground zero, it was heavily affected. Fed by such power, it literally grew like a weed." And Swamp Thing replies, "Then I must contain this monstrosity before things get any worse." And then he proceeds to grow his body into a gigantic version of himself. And while he's doing that, we see Thunder Petal is tearing up the town even more, ripping off the tops of houses. And as he does this, the people run away that are inside the house, of course. And the narration says, "Thunder Petal has never known such joy. Not since the day the making goddess first gave him life has he felt so free. And the making goddess he's talking about is Tefe. And then Thunder Petal smashes another house, and the narration says, he likes being a war god. And as he's smashing, he's saying, la 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 la, la la la. But his laws are cut off quick as Swamp Thing grabs him by the neck with a giant hand, and Thunder Petal grabs Swamp Thing's arms, and Swamp Thing says to him, I don't know if you can understand what I'm saying, but you must stop this. And we get a good look at Swamp Thing's big kaiju body. It pretty much looks the same as his new body, except he doesn't have any flesh in between his ribs, and his torso is just completely empty. But he has a very big trunk for a spine that you can see, and the rest of his body just looks the same as it was. So in answer to Swamp Thing's pleading, Thunder Petal just punches Swamp Thing in the face, knocking him down. Then Thunder Petal takes a giant tree and rips it out by the roots and stabs it into Swamp Thing's abdomen, and he says, la la la. But of course, that doesn't do anything to Swamp Thing, and he pulls the tree out of his abdomen and he says, that's enough. Then he lunges forward and grabs Thunder Petal's wrists, and he forces Thunder Petal's arms up into the air. But Thunder Petal breaks free, and he punches Swamp Thing again. And Swamp Thing falls backward, and he actually smashes his head at a very weird angle into the ground, and he lands saying, ugh! Then I guess because he was losing, he actually leaves his body and travels through the green to where Lady Jane and Tefe are at, and he grows a small, regular-sized version of himself again. And he actually surprises Lady Jane because she exclaims, Prime Founder! And Swamp Thing says to her, this is more serious than I thought. While I can apparently hurt the creature, I can't control it. It's not truly part of the green as we know it. And Lady Jane replies saying, it is as I feared. The daisy is a thing of Tefe's making. As a human elemental, her creations are neither animal nor vegetable, but a synthesis. Only Tefe can unmake what she has made. And Swamp Thing says, she is little more than a baby. Do you think she will understand what we're asking of her? And Lady Jane replies, she understands more than you realize. And Swamp Thing says, very well, Tefe. And then he turns and sees that while they were talking and debating what they should do, Tefe has walked off towards the town on her own, and she is going to face Thunder Petal by herself. So she enters the town, and she walks right underneath Thunder Petal's legs, and she looks up at him, sucking her thumb, and Thunder Petal actually reaches down and picks her up in his hand. And at that moment, Swamp Thing and Lady Jane get to the town, and Swamp Thing begins to freak out, saying, Tefe! But Lady Jane holds him back, saying, no, let her handle it. And then we see Thunder Petal looking evilly at little Tefe in his hand, and he's smiling like he was when he was about to eat that man earlier. But Tefe looks at him back, and she actually pulls her thumb out of her mouth, and she says, bad flower. And then all of a sudden, his body begins to shrink back to normal size, and as it does, the narration says, no, this wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him, not to Thunder Petal, King of the Daisies. So as Thunder Petal shrinks, of course, Tefe can no longer fit in his hand, and she begins to fall. And just before she hits the ground, Swamp Thing catches her, and she says, Tefe good, Daddy? And then she gives him a big hug, and Swamp Thing hugs her back, saying, that's my girl. Then realizing he has lost all his power, Thunder Petal begins to run, and the narration says, it isn't fair. He could have been Lord of all daisies, had he not incurred the wrath of his maker. Then we see the shadow of Tefe appear behind him as he runs, and he's screaming, la 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 la! And Tefe reaches out and grabs him, and she looks at him as if to say, you're in big trouble, mister. And he pleads with her, saying, la la la! And she says to him, bye-bye, flower. And as his body decomposes, his last words are, la la ah. Then we cut to Swamp Thing, Tefe, and Lady Jane walking hand in hand, and Swamp Thing is smiling, saying, I'm glad that is over with. I shudder to think what would have happened if that thing had reached Huma. Now I can talk to Abby privately and explain my reasons for deceiving her as I did. And then he looks around and realizes he has not seen Abby for a while, and he says, by the way, where is she? Then we cut to Huma, Louisiana, and we're at Chester's house. And we see at the front of it, there's a bunch of cars parked, and one of them is a truck, and it has a bunch of moving boxes in it, because if you remember, Chester is moving away. Then we cut to inside his house, And we see a couple of familiar faces that are helping him move. We see Carl, his old roommate, and Troy, Carl's boyfriend, and also Jojo, the owner of the bar, is there. And Chester is saying to Carl and Troy, I want to thank you all for letting me move into your apartment in New Orleans. You didn't have to do that. And Carl is saying, Bull, you helped us out when we needed it. It's only fair that we return the favor, right, Troy? And Troy replies, damn straight, sweetie. And then behind them, Jojo picks up a large box and begins to walk out, and he says, you know, peepers, Huma won't be the same without you. And then Troy passes Chester with boxes in his hands, and he says, this must be hard for you, man. I mean, you've lived here a long time, right? And as Chester picks up a box, he says, yeah, a lot has happened during the years I've been here. Some of it good and some of it bad. And under good, we see Abby giving him a big hug, and under bad, we see the cross burning on his lawn. And as we turn the page, we see a bunch of memories from him having good times with Swamp Thing and Abby and Tefe, and he continues narrating over these panels saying, I've met some of the finest people I've ever known in my life, while getting to know more about myself as well. And I should say that while they're talking and stuff, they're walking between the truck and the house. So as Jojo is loading the truck with the boxes, he's saying, I'm surprised your lady friend ain't here to see you off. And Chester replies, me too. I was hoping to get to see her one last time before I left. I guess she must be at home looking after the kid. Then someone calls out behind him, Chester? And as Chester turns around, he sees Abby and she is crying and she says, do you have room for one more? So it seems Abby has had enough of the Swamp Thing life and she is trying to leave Huma as well. But we will have to see what happens in the next issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comic-books, all one word, at gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.